The unlikely encounter. General Victor Adams, a man whose very name commanded respect within military circles, stood quietly in the middle of a bustling airport terminal. The usual hum of travelers, the clinking of rolling luggage, and the muffled announcements in the background faded as he became lost in his thoughts. His eyes wandered over the crowd, but his mind was far from the present moment. His most recent meeting with senior military officers had been fraught with tension, debates over resource allocation, and concerns about the readiness of the armed forces. The weight of such decisions was heavy, and Victor had learned to carry it without letting it burden his every step. Victor Adams wasn't a man who took his rank lightly, yet he chose not to display it in every aspect of his life. While many high-ranking officials preferred the luxury of private jets or exclusive services, Victor found solace in the simplicity of commercial air travel. To him, it was important to remain connected to the lives of the everyday person. He understood that his role as a general wasn't just about leading armies on distant battlefields, but about connecting with the people he served. By traveling anonymously among them, he could better understand the world he fought to protect. On this particular day, he was dressed plainly in a navy blue shirt and dark trousers. His military decorations, often a source of pride, were hidden beneath the confines of his jacket, a quiet nod to his desire to blend in. The only indication of his position was the steady, confident manner in which he carried himself, something that couldn't be hidden no matter how much he tried. As he approached the check-in counter, he offered a polite nod to the young woman behind the desk, who returned the gesture with a distracted smile. Victor handed her his boarding pass, a business-class ticket that he had earned after a string of exhausting back-to-back meetings. It was a rare indulgence for him, one that he had been looking forward to. A moment to relax and recharge before the next wave of responsibilities hit. The attendant's fingers clicked rapidly over the keyboard as she processed his ticket. Victor watched the steady stream of travelers flowing in and out of the terminal, his gaze unfocused as his thoughts drifted back to the weighty decisions he had made earlier that morning. He thought of the men and women under his command, and how he could ensure they were equipped to handle the challenges ahead. His mind never stopped, and even here, amidst the sea of strangers, he felt the familiar pressure to be more than just a leader. He needed to be a protector, a provider, a figure of strength and guidance. His reverie was broken when the attendant finally spoke up, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone curt. "Your seat's been reassigned." Victor blinked, a slight frown crossing his face. He had confirmed this seat days ago. "Reassigned?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with confusion. The attendant didn't meet his gaze, her eyes still focused on the screen. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys, seemingly unaware of the discomfort her words had caused. "Yes, sir. The flight's full, and there's no longer space in business class." She handed him back his boarding pass without looking at him, a gesture that felt dismissive. Victor stared at the ticket for a moment, disbelief growing in his chest. This didn't make sense. He had been assigned to seat 1A, one of the most coveted spots on the plane. It had been confirmed days ago. He tried to process the situation, but it felt as though something was off. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone firm now. "I was confirmed for that seat. It's been arranged." The attendant, still not making eye contact, nodded mechanically. "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing I can do. The flight is full." Victor felt the frustration rising within him, but he remained composed. He had been trained to face far more difficult situations with greater calm. In that moment, he realized that the issue wasn't simply about a seat. It was about respect. Respect for the uniform, respect for the role he played, and respect for the person standing before him. "I'll take a seat in coach then," he said, his voice carrying a calmness that surprised even him. "I'll handle it." As he turned to leave the counter, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had expected a certain level of courtesy, even if he were in civilian clothes. He understood that not everyone would recognize him, but there was still something about the lack of acknowledgement that left a sour taste in his mouth. Victor made his way toward the security gates, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his humility and his ability to blend in with those around him. But this encounter was different. It wasn't just about the inconvenience of a reassigned seat. It was about the growing disconnect between his life as a military leader and the lives of the people he had sworn to protect. As he walked through the terminal, he thought about the countless hours spent behind closed doors, making decisions that would shape the course of history. He thought about the soldiers who would never know his name, but who relied on his decisions to ensure their safety. And he thought about the unspoken sacrifices that were often invisible to the world. But what troubled him most was the nagging feeling that his sense of duty and service was being undermined by the very people he served. As he settled into his new seat in coach, surrounded by fellow travelers who were busy with their own concerns, he realized something important. Leadership wasn't just about titles, about power, or about influence. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, even when the world around you didn't recognize your worth. As the plane began its ascent into the sky, Victor Adams closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to reflect on the lessons that life had taught him. No matter how high he rose in rank, no matter how many medals and decorations adorned his chest, he would always be one of the people. And sometimes that was the most important reminder of all. A moment of reflection. The flight was in full motion, the steady hum of the engines lulling Victor Adams into a contemplative state. He sat in the cramped coach section, surrounded by people who were completely unaware of who he was. The first-class cabins, where luxury and comfort awaited the wealthier passengers, seemed a distant world, separated by more than just the thin partition of the plane. Victor was not bothered by this, though. He had chosen to sit here for a reason. He had long ago reconciled himself to the idea that status was temporary, fleeting. As a general, he wielded immense power over troops, policy, and defense strategy. But that did not mean he could not see himself as part of the greater whole, a mere citizen among many. There were countless men and women across the country, across the globe, who would never hold the title of general or enjoy the privileges of his rank. He had seen so much of the world through his military career. The joys, the sacrifices, and the crushing defeats that shaped a nation. In many ways, he saw himself as just one thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of human existence. He was no more important than any other person, though the roles they played might differ. Still, the incident at the check-in desk had stuck with him. As he looked out the small window at the endless expanse of clouds, he could not shake the feeling that the brief encounter had been a symbol of something much larger. What had begun as a mere inconvenience had slowly morphed into a deeper reflection on the nature of respect and hierarchy. Was the lack of recognition at the check-in desk just an unfortunate oversight, or was it a sign of something more troubling in the way society viewed authority and its symbols? Victor closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The flight was not long, but the time seemed endless. The air inside the cabin felt stifling to him. He had been on enough flights to know that the discomfort of coach wasn't the issue. The issue was the sense of powerlessness that arose from being treated like any other traveler. In his role, Victor had become accustomed to making decisions that impacted not only the lives of his soldiers, but also the course of military strategy. For the first time in a long while, he felt entirely without control, and it unsettled him. Yet, amid his frustration, there was a realization. It wasn't the world's lack of recognition that truly mattered. It was how he chose to navigate through such moments. Leadership was not defined by titles or privileges. It was about what one could give in times of hardship, how one could stay true to their values when the world around them might be unkind or indifferent. Leadership, Victor now realized, came from within. It wasn't about asserting dominance or being seen, but about how you maintained your composure when no one was watching. As the plane glided steadily through the sky, Victor's thoughts drifted back to the many men and women he had served with over the years. They had seen the worst of humanity and fought valiantly to protect their country's ideals. In many ways, They had been the real heroes, the ones who faced the front line and bore the brunt of the consequences, not the generals or commanders who stayed behind in fortified rooms making strategic decisions. He thought of the soldiers in the trenches, those who had lost limbs, those who had faced endless battles without seeing the light of day, and those who had returned home only to face a lifetime of silent trauma. These were the individuals whose stories truly mattered. His own story, his own rank, was insignificant compared to the sacrifices they had made. Even in moments of personal discomfort, he had to remind himself of this truth. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of the people around him, each absorbed in their own world. It was easy to forget the hardships of others when one's own life was comfortable. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out drinks and snacks, their polite smiles seemingly designed to keep everything running smoothly. But Victor knew better. Behind every smile and every choreographed movement was an individual facing their own battles, their own hardships, many of which went unnoticed. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing the altitude and estimated time of arrival. The usual pleasantries followed, but to Victor, the words seemed distant, almost irrelevant. In this quiet moment, the realization struck him like a wave. He had lived a life steeped in structure, in authority, and in certainty. Yet the more he reflected, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had been afforded the luxury of certainty in his decisions, of being able to make hard choices that would be enacted by others. But outside of those walls, in the civilian world, people had no such luxury. They lived in the gray areas, navigating a world where leadership was often more about adaptability than command. Victor had always prided himself on the clarity with which he made decisions, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for him to embrace the uncertainty of the world outside his military base. For the first time in a long while, he considered what it would mean to step away from the rigid structures he had built around himself. He was used to being the person others turned to for answers, but now he wondered, who did he turn to when he was unsure? The thought lingered, unsettling him even more. His thoughts turned to the men and women in his life who had always been by his side, even when the world seemed to conspire against them. The friends, the colleagues, and the soldiers who had carried on despite impossible odds. They were the real force behind the military's power, the ones who made his decisions possible. Perhaps it was time for him to learn to trust not just his ability to lead, but the strength of those around him. The people who worked tirelessly, often without recognition or reward, were the true backbone of the nation's strength. As Victor sat back in his seat, he thought of the countless times he had pushed through difficult decisions, never stopping to wonder if there was another way. Now he found himself reconsidering the very nature of leadership. The incident at the check-in desk had been a catalyst for a larger reflection on humility, sacrifice, and strength. In a world that often placed value on power and status, he was learning that true leadership was about staying grounded, connected to the people who made everything possible. The small inconveniences of life, like being relegated to a coach seat on a commercial flight, were a reminder of how fleeting power and influence could be. It was a humbling experience, and as much as he disliked the discomfort of the situation, it was teaching him something far more important. There would always be moments when the world would fail to recognize him. But in those moments, he would find his strength not in the recognition of his rank, but in his ability to stand firm in his values. His humility, his willingness to learn, and his dedication to those he served would define him far more than any title or seat on a plane ever could. As the plane began its descent into its destination, Victor Adams found a sense of peace in this realization. Though he might never be able to control how others saw him, he could always control how he saw the world, and how he chose to lead within it. The unexpected revelation. As the hours passed in the cramped coach section, Victor's mind, still preoccupied by the subtle discomfort of his current situation, began to shift. The landscape of his thoughts transformed, moving from the immediate frustrations of his day to deeper, more personal reflections. The plane's steady hum became a backdrop for his quiet contemplation, and he found himself considering a question that had never fully surfaced in his mind before. What did true respect really mean? Victor had always been someone who placed immense value on respect, earning it, giving it, and demanding it from others. As a high-ranking military officer, he had been accustomed to both the privileges and the burdens of his position. He had long ago accepted the reality that his status would often place him in situations where others were eager to please, and that deference from subordinates and the public would come with the rank. What had never fully dawned on him, however, was how much of that respect was based on outward appearances, how much was tied to uniforms, titles, and visible symbols of authority. It was only now, in the anonymity of a crowded commercial flight, that he realized how little recognition he had received. The flight attendant's curt response to his boarding pass, no acknowledgement of his uniform, no indication that he was anything other than a regular passenger had jarred him. Initially, he had chalked it up to an unfortunate oversight, but with the passage of time, that incident became more than just a minor inconvenience. It became a symbol, a microcosm of how people often treat one another based on preconceived notions or external cues. Victor couldn't help but wonder if respect, at its core, was something more than simply being seen. He thought back to the countless men and women in his life, those who had served by his side, often without fanfare or recognition. There was Lieutenant Sarah Morris, a quiet but brilliant strategist who had saved countless lives during a mission in the Middle East. There was Sergeant James Taylor, a no-nonsense leader whose loyalty and courage had never been in question, but who had never once sought out the spotlight. Victor had always admired them for their selflessness, for their ability to lead without the need for acknowledgement. In many ways, they had been the real backbone of his career, and yet they never expected special treatment. They had earned respect, not through titles, but through the simple force of their actions. In the dim light of the cabin, Victor found himself thinking about how much he had taken those moments for granted. Perhaps the respect he had longed for, the respect he assumed was inherent in his rank, was nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The true essence of respect, he now realized, was not about titles or authority. It was about one's actions and character. It wasn't about being seen for what you were, but about being valued for who you truly were. His gaze shifted to the passengers around him, all of whom were lost in their own worlds. Some were glued to their screens, others were engaged in quiet conversation. He wondered if any of them had ever felt the same way he had just moments before, unseen, unnoticed, or dismissed based on something as superficial as appearance. The realization struck him with an unexpected force. While he had spent so much of his life being driven by the need to be seen and respected for his position, the people around him had likely experienced their own struggles for recognition. Perhaps the most profound way to honor those struggles was not by seeking more recognition for himself, but by offering it to others who might not have a voice. Victor glanced at the flight attendant as she passed down the aisle. She was just doing her job, moving from one row to the next with a practiced efficiency. He noticed the slight tension in her posture, the way she politely engaged with the passengers without really connecting with them. It occurred to him that she, too, was probably just another person trying to get through the day, navigating a world that often expected more than she could give. What if she, like him, had a story that went unnoticed by those around her? As the thought settled in his mind, Victor's discomfort began to ebb. He wasn't alone in his experience. Everyone on this flight, every individual in every seat, had their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. The world was full of people who were invisible, in one way or another, to the eyes of others. For the first time in a long while, Victor found himself yearning not for the respect of others, but for a deeper connection, for a recognition of the shared human experience that bound them all together. His gaze wandered to the window again. The clouds outside had thickened, a blanket of white stretching across the sky as the plane cut through the air. The vast expanse of space below was both humbling and beautiful. It was a reminder that no matter how significant or insignificant a person might feel at any given moment, They were just one small part of something much greater. A single individual, no matter their rank or position, was just one thread in the intricate, ever-changing tapestry of life. Victor had always believed that the purpose of his career, his rank, and his leadership was to protect and guide those who needed it most. But now, as he reflected on his own life and the lives of those around him, he saw a greater truth. Leadership was not just about protecting others. It was about elevating them. It was about recognizing the value in people not because of their position, but because of their inherent humanity. It was about lifting others up, even when they couldn't see their own worth. The realization brought a quiet peace to his heart. Perhaps it was time for him to embrace a new form of leadership, one that wasn't based on authority or rank, but on the ability to see and acknowledge the worth of others, regardless of their station in life. For too long, he had been trapped in the idea that leadership was about commanding respect, about being seen as someone powerful and unyielding. Now, he understood that true leadership was about humility, about seeing people as they truly were, without the filters of power or prestige. Victor shifted in his seat, the quiet hum of the engine still present in the background. The plane was descending now, preparing to land at its destination. His mind felt clearer, more focused, and he realized something that had eluded him for so long. He had been so focused on the respect he thought he deserved that he had forgotten to offer it to others. The recognition he sought wasn't something to be demanded. It was something to be given, freely and without expectation. As the plane began its descent into the airport, Victor knew that the journey he had embarked on was more than just a physical one. It was a journey of introspection, of realizing the importance of recognizing others, of understanding that true leadership came from acknowledging the humanity of those around him. No title, no rank, no position would ever be as important as the simple act of seeing and valuing people for who they truly were. And in that quiet, contemplative moment, as the plane touched down on solid ground, Victor Adams felt more at peace with himself than he had in a long time. A lesson in humility. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the wheels meeting the tarmac as the engines whined down to a low hum. For a moment, the usual rush of activity, seatbelts being undone, bags being gathered, the slight chaos that came with the plane's arrival, was muted for Victor. He remained seated, staring out the window at the world beyond. Despite the comforting hum of the airplane's systems returning to stillness, his thoughts were anything but calm. The reflection he had undergone during the flight had shifted something deep inside him. The world, it seemed, was more complicated than he had imagined. Where once he had viewed leadership as a direct line from rank to respect, from position to deference, he now saw it differently. The incident at the check-in desk, while minor in the grand scheme of things, had opened his eyes to the nuance and depth of what it meant to truly lead. As the other passengers began to shuffle toward the exit, Victor stood up, stretching his stiff legs and pulling his jacket back on. The weight of his military decorations pressed against him, but he didn't immediately reach to adjust them. They felt heavy now, not because of the weight of his service, but because of the layers of expectation they carried. They represented authority, respect, and recognition, but in the quiet solitude of his own thoughts, Victor felt a pull towards something else, something that could not be measured in metal and fabric. Stepping off the plane and into the crowded terminal, Victor was once again struck by the anonymity that surrounded him. As he walked toward the baggage claim, his footsteps seemed muffled by the throngs of people rushing past. He was just another traveler now, another passenger on a crowded flight. He wondered if anyone around him had an inkling of who he was, or if they, too, had their own moments of reflection, their own struggles that remained hidden beneath the surface. The fact that they likely didn't recognize him, or perhaps didn't even care, was oddly liberating. In many ways, Victor had always been a man defined by his responsibilities, by the people who looked to him for guidance and the weight of the decisions he made. Now, however, he found himself questioning that identity. Who was he beyond the uniform? Who was he in the moments when he was not General Victor Adams, but just a man walking through an airport waiting for his luggage. The question was deceptively simple, but it stirred something deep within him, an unspoken desire to reconnect with parts of himself he had neglected. As he reached the baggage claim, he noticed a young family standing by the carousel. A mother, father, and their 2 young children, barely old enough to walk, were eagerly watching the bags arrive, pointing out their suitcases as they passed by. The father, a broad-shouldered man in a worn-out jacket, looked at Victor for a moment. Their eyes met briefly, and the father gave him a small, polite nod. It wasn't the kind of recognition Victor was used to, the one that came with a military uniform or a title, but it was genuine, a simple acknowledgement between 2 men passing through the same moment. For some reason, it felt more meaningful than the salutes and deferential looks he received on a daily basis. Victor nodded back, smiling in response, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to live a life completely outside the military, to simply be a person, not a symbol. It was a fleeting thought, but it brought with it a sense of freedom. Freedom from expectations, from burdens, from the ever-watchful eye of the public and his peers. As the young family gathered their luggage and made their way toward the exit, the mother briefly glanced over at him, her face lighting up with a warm smile. She didn't seem to recognize him, but her kindness was palpable. It struck Victor as odd how the simplest moments of human connection, moments without the need for acknowledgement or rank, could leave such a lasting impression. While he waited for his own luggage, his mind wandered to the lives of ordinary people, the ones who lived without fanfare, the ones who went unnoticed, yet shaped the world with their every action. The single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet, the teacher inspiring her students, the soldier in the field carrying out orders with no hope of recognition. The more Victor thought about it, the more he realized how much he had taken the smallest gestures for granted. It wasn't the grandiose actions of leadership that shaped the world. It was the quiet acts of kindness, humility, and selflessness that often went unnoticed. In those moments, real strength was born. His thoughts were interrupted when his luggage appeared on the conveyor belt. He grabbed his suitcase, a basic black piece of luggage that had seen better days, and made his way toward the exit. The terminal buzzed with activity, travelers hurrying to their next destinations, each with their own story. He couldn't help but feel that there was so much he had yet to learn from them. As he moved toward the exit doors, he took in the faces of the crowd, noticing the exhaustion in some eyes, the excitement in others, the anxiety in a few. They were all in different stages of their lives, all carrying their own burdens, their own triumphs. And in each face, Victor saw a piece of himself. Outside, the crisp air greeted him, and for the first time in a long while, Victor felt a deep sense of humility. The world was vast, and he was just one man in it. His role was important, yes, but it was not more important than anyone else's. He wasn't the only one making sacrifices or facing challenges. The thought gave him a sense of perspective, a clarity that had been missing for years. His rank and his accomplishments were just part of the picture, not the defining elements of who he was. As he walked to his car, he couldn't help but smile, the realization of the day sinking in deeper. He had thought that leadership was about having all the answers, about being the one people turned to when things went wrong. But true leadership, he now understood, was about listening as much as speaking, about recognizing the worth in everyone, regardless of their position. It was about embracing humility and offering kindness, not because you expected something in return, but because that was the true measure of strength. The next morning, as he sat at his desk reviewing the military briefings that awaited him, Victor found himself carrying this new understanding into his work. His decisions would still affect the lives of many, but now he would make them with a clearer, more compassionate perspective. The weight of responsibility would remain, but the burden of ego had been lifted. He was a leader, yes, but he was also a human being, a man with flaws, with limitations, with a deep desire to connect with those around him. And in that connection, he found the true power of leadership. Rebuilding bridges. Victor Adams sat in his office early the next morning, his gaze shifting between the stack of reports on his desk and the faint morning light creeping through the blinds. The day was just beginning, but his thoughts were far from routine. It had been nearly a week since his encounter at the airport, and the quiet reflection from the flight had continued to stir his mind. Today, as he prepared for another busy day of meetings and decisions, something inside him felt different. A shift in the way he saw his role, his responsibilities, and the people he led. The initial frustration that had consumed him during the flight had now evolved into a deeper understanding. The more he reflected, the more he realized that the real purpose of his leadership wasn't to command from a place of authority, but to build relationships based on respect and empathy. The leader, he understood now, must be someone who inspires trust and connection, not just by what they do, but by how they make others feel. His military career had been full of moments where he had made tough, sometimes unpopular decisions for the greater good, but he had seldom stopped to consider the human cost of those decisions. What had been missing, he realized, was the human element, the bridge between his position and the people who served under him, the ones who faced the brunt of those decisions. Victor took a deep breath, his hands resting on the stack of papers in front of him, but his mind far away from them. He thought about the soldiers he commanded, the men and women who wore the same uniform he did, but who had vastly different experiences, challenges, and fears. Many of them were young, far from home, and burdened by the weight of a world they could not yet fully comprehend. Others were seasoned veterans, hardened by years of service, but still carrying the scars of past battles. These were the people who trusted him, followed his lead, and lived with the consequences of his decisions. Victor realized, with a clarity that had eluded him for so long, that he needed to be more than a commander to them. He needed to be a listener, a mentor, a source of genuine support. He needed to rebuild the bridges between himself and those he led, not just to give orders, but to truly understand their lives, their struggles, and their needs. The incident at the airport had sparked something inside him, an awareness that leadership wasn't about being seen or acknowledged. It was about seeing others, acknowledging their worth, and lifting them up. Determined to put this new mindset into action, Victor decided to make a change in how he interacted with his team. The next day, he called for a meeting with his senior officers, but this time, it wasn't just about strategy or military movements. This meeting would focus on something he had rarely prioritized before: the welfare of his soldiers. He wanted to hear from his officers about their men and women on the ground, their concerns, and their needs, not just in terms of resources or equipment, but in terms of morale, mental health, and well-being. As the day went on, Victor's schedule filled with meetings, briefings, and calls with higher-ups. But for once, he felt the weight of his responsibilities in a different way, not as a leader of a vast military machine, but as a man who was responsible for the lives of real people with real struggles. He took time to check in with his officers individually, asking them not only about the technical aspects of their duties, but also about the personal lives of the soldiers under their command. How were they holding up emotionally? Were there any issues they were facing outside of the regular duties? Were there ways to ensure they had the support they needed when they weren't in uniform? The answers were eye-opening. Many of his officers spoke candidly about the pressures their teams were facing: stress from constant deployments, struggles with family life, and the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress. These were things that Victor had been aware of in theory, but hearing about them directly from those on the front lines hit him harder than he had expected. It became clear that leadership wasn't just about making decisions for their tactical advantage. It was about nurturing the people who carried out those decisions. Over the next few weeks, Victor made it a point to integrate this new approach into his leadership style. He held regular meetings with soldiers of all ranks, encouraging open communication and creating a more inclusive environment where everyone felt heard. He reached out to the chaplains, counselors, and medical staff to ensure that the mental health and emotional well-being of his soldiers were being prioritized. He even began visiting the field, something he had not done often in the past, to speak directly with the troops, asking them about their experiences and listening to their concerns. It was during one of these visits to a forward operating base that Victor truly understood the power of human connection. As he walked through the base, shaking hands and talking with soldiers, a young sergeant stopped him, hesitating before speaking up. "General," the sergeant began, his voice slightly unsure, "I just wanted to thank you for coming out here. It means a lot to us. You know, sometimes it feels like the higher-ups forget about us out here." The sergeant's voice held a note of vulnerability, but it was mixed with a kind of appreciation Victor rarely saw. Victor was taken aback by the sincerity of the words. He had assumed his presence would be expected, something a general did as part of his duties, but the emotional weight of that simple statement resonated deeply. "I'm here because you matter," Victor replied, his voice steady but warm. "Your service, your sacrifices, your well-being, those things matter to me. And I want to make sure you have everything you need to do your job, safely and with confidence." The sergeant nodded, a faint smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "We appreciate that more than you know, sir. We're all in this together, right?" Victor's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and humility. He had spent so much of his career focused on the grand strategy, the bigger picture, the overarching mission. But in that moment, he realized that leadership wasn't just about shaping the future. It was about shaping the present for the people who lived and worked in it. As the days passed, Victor continued to make adjustments to his leadership. His meetings with senior officers became more focused on the human side of command, not just the operational side. He spent more time connecting with his soldiers, both in formal settings and informal ones, and began to understand the complexities of their lives outside the battlefield. He made it clear that his door was always open to them, not just to talk about orders, but to discuss their concerns, their needs, and their dreams. Victor's new approach did not go unnoticed. His officers began to see a shift in the atmosphere within the ranks. Morale improved, and a sense of camaraderie grew among the soldiers. There was a renewed sense of trust between Victor and his team, one that transcended rank and title. The respect that had once been tied to his uniform and his decisions now came from a deeper, more personal place, a respect that was built on genuine care and connection. As the weeks turned into months, Victor continued to learn from those around him. He found that true leadership wasn't about commanding from the top. It was about walking alongside those who followed you, understanding their struggles, and lifting them up. The incident at the airport, though small in comparison to the broader scope of his career, had been the catalyst for a profound transformation in the way he saw his role. It had taught him that the greatest leaders are those who never lose sight of the humanity in others. And as Victor stood on the tarmac one morning, watching his soldiers board the transport planes that would carry them to their next mission, he felt a deep sense of pride, not in the medals adorning his chest, but in the relationships he had built, the trust he had earned, and the soldiers he had served alongside. True leadership, he now knew, was about being present for others, even in the most challenging of times. It was about seeing the strength in others, not just the orders they followed. The unseen strength. As time went on, General Victor Adams continued to evolve into a leader who sought not just victory in battles, but also victory in human connection. His transformation, sparked by a small but significant incident at an airport, had slowly permeated every aspect of his leadership. The lessons he had learned during that quiet flight, when he had been forced to confront the limitations of his rank and position, were now guiding him through the most important decisions he would face. The days had grown increasingly busy as the military faced new challenges, but Victor's approach had shifted. The strategic meetings, the critical decisions, and the operational directives all still needed to be made, but his focus had expanded. He had become more attuned to the needs of those under his command, not only as soldiers but as individuals with their own personal battles, fears, and aspirations. It was an ongoing process, one that required patience, humility, and the constant effort to listen. One morning, as he reviewed a new set of orders for an upcoming operation, Victor found himself once again thinking about the nature of leadership. He had spent so many years striving to make the right decisions based on logic, military strategy, and national interest. Those decisions had been necessary, crucial even, but the weight of them had never fully allowed him to consider the emotional cost they might bear on those who executed them. His eyes wandered to the photograph on his desk, a group shot of his battalion, all smiling, standing proudly together. Many of those faces had since been replaced by others, and some had even fallen in service, but the faces in the photograph spoke to him now, not just as soldiers, but as people with lives and stories that went far beyond the battlefield. That afternoon, a series of reports landed on his desk detailing the psychological toll that long deployments, high-stress environments, and exposure to conflict were having on his troops. There were several incidents of soldiers suffering from PTSD, others struggling with substance abuse, and some who had become withdrawn, distant, even resigned to their circumstances. Victor read the reports carefully, each word striking him deeply. He had seen the signs over the years: the distant stares, the hollow eyes, the quiet withdrawal. But he had never truly understood their weight. The operational reports had always been his focus, not the human cost behind the numbers. Yet, as he sat back in his chair and reflected on the faces in the photograph on his desk, he knew now that his role as a leader was not simply to lead troops into battle. It was to ensure they returned home whole. Victor immediately made plans to address these concerns. That evening, he gathered a team of experts, psychologists, counselors, and medical officers, to discuss the growing mental health crisis among the ranks. The meeting was unlike any he had ever held before. There were no strategic maps on the table, no tactical assessments, no mission plans. This time, it was about the soldiers, about their well-being, and how the military could better support them during and after deployment. He listened carefully as the mental health professionals spoke about the importance of early intervention, of creating an environment where soldiers felt safe to talk about their struggles, and of the need for better integration of mental health care within the military's framework. The more they spoke, the more it became clear to Victor that the mental wounds inflicted by war were just as real, just as debilitating as the physical ones. The fight did not end when the soldiers came home. In many ways, it had just begun. "I want a plan of action," Victor said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want this to be something we talk about in meetings. I want real steps, real solutions, and I want them implemented immediately." Over the next few weeks, Victor worked tirelessly to overhaul the mental health resources available to his troops. He worked closely with his team to set up confidential support programs, stress management workshops, and peer support groups. He made it a point to have these resources readily available to all soldiers, ensuring they felt comfortable seeking help without fear of judgment. He spoke openly about mental health in his public addresses, encouraging soldiers to prioritize their emotional well-being, just as they would their physical health. The shift was not immediate, but the results were slowly beginning to show. Victor's office, once filled with military reports and high-level meetings, became a more open and welcoming space. He would spend hours talking with soldiers one-on-one, offering them an outlet to speak their minds and share their experiences. It was in these quiet, personal moments that he began to see the true strength of those around him. The soldiers who spoke of their struggles, the ones who were brave enough to admit their pain, had a resilience that went unnoticed by many. It wasn't the soldiers who stood at attention, who displayed perfect discipline in every moment, who impressed him most. It was the ones who, despite their vulnerabilities, continued to serve. They were the unseen heroes, the ones who fought not only for their country, but for their own peace of mind, their own healing. There were moments when Victor felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the work ahead. As much as he wanted to protect and nurture every single person under his command, he knew that it was impossible to shield them from everything. There would always be struggles, both internal and external. But what mattered was how he responded to them. What mattered was whether he could be a leader who not only guided his soldiers on the battlefield, but also supported them in their darkest hours, the ones that occurred long after the war had ended. One particular encounter stayed with Victor. During a routine visit to a recovery center for veterans, he met a former surgeon named Robert who had been with the military for over 20 years. Robert had seen things that no one should ever have to see, and he had paid the price in the form of PTSD. He had been to hell and back, battling demons both real and imagined. Despite his challenges, Robert had stayed in the military longer than most, serving with the same tenacity and dedication as ever. Yet, in the quiet of the recovery center, Robert had broken down in front of Victor, something that never would have happened in the presence of others. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Robert confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been through the wars, but I'm not sure I can win the war inside myself." Victor listened carefully, his usual military precision replaced with empathy. "You're not alone in this," Victor replied, his voice calm and assuring. "There's no shame in asking for help. You've fought so many battles already, but this is a different kind of fight, and I'll be here with you every step of the way." In that moment, Victor realized the truth of what he had been learning over the past several months. Leadership was not just about the decisions made in moments of crisis or conflict. It was about showing up for the people who followed you, even when the situation seemed beyond repair. It was about offering your strength when theirs had been exhausted, and offering your understanding when they had none left for themselves. As Victor left the recovery center that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead was long, and the road was uncertain, but he knew that true strength wasn't about leading from the front. It was about being present for those who needed you, in moments of both triumph and defeat. It wasn't about fighting wars on battlefields. It was about fighting for the well-being of the people who fought for you. It was about recognizing that the greatest battles often take place within, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a leader could do was to simply be there for others, to listen and to support. And in that, Victor Adams found a deeper, more profound purpose than he had ever known before. He had been given the gift of understanding, and with that understanding came the responsibility to rebuild the bridges he had once overlooked, the bridges between rank and humanity, authority and compassion, strength and vulnerability.